Hey there, everyone. Today we have the amazing honor of welcoming Vanessa Nakate onto the Traipsing Global on Wheels podcast hour. She is a climate activist from Uganda. She was the first Fridays for Future climate activist in Uganda and founder of the Rise Up climate movement in order to amplify the voices of activists from Africa. Her work includes raising awareness to the dangers of climate change, the causes, and the impacts. She led the campaign for Save Congo rainforest, which is facing massive deforestation. This campaign later spread to other regions, from Africa to Europe. She is also working on a project that involves installation of solar and institutional stoves in schools. Without further ado, let's listen in on that conversation with Vanessa Nakate. Vanessa Nakate, welcome to the Traipsing Global on Wheels podcast hour.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. I'm very happy you can join us today. I know you've been doing some amazing work in Uganda, and you've been interviewed by Angelina Jolie and Jane Fonda and a bunch of amazing people, and very well deserved. So our first question to you is, so you wrote in the Times and Reuters Foundation News that I'm quoting you, okay? I became a climate activist because of the impacts I was witnessing at home in Uganda. Seeing people die, lose their families, their homes, and the dreams they had for the future, all as a result of the climate crisis. So my question to you is, can you go into further detail on how climate change is affecting your city of Kampala and Uganda at large as a country?
Well, Uganda as a country is one that heavily depends on agriculture, and it covers so much of the economy of the country, but also many people, especially in the rural communities, they heavily depend on the food that they grow. So you find that with the increasing global temperatures, the weather patterns are being disrupted, hence bringing about more intensity of droughts, longer dry spells, and torrential rainfall, bringing about the floods in the different parts of the country. When you go to the northern part of the country, they're experiencing very long droughts, and many of them are having their crops dry up, hence losing the access to food, and also their wells, their streams, and any water sources drying up. So clearly showing how much climate change greatly threatens the availability of food and water for the people in the northern part of the country. When you go to the eastern part of the country, in the Mount Elgon area, they have experienced devastating landslides and flooding, and this has caused massive destruction, and people lose their family members, loss of property. The result is loss of hope and just dreams for the future, because when a community or when a family loses all these things, that means that some of the students will stop going to school, since their school expenses were being catered for by the crops that their parents were selling, maybe to the market, to the people. So it's really very, very devastating to see how much climate change doesn't only bring about the primary effects that we see, those are the floods or the landslides or the droughts, but it also carries secondary effects. But that I'm talking about the problems that follow up in a community or in a family after they have experienced a climate disaster. And those are problems like having to struggle to get water, and having to struggle to get food, some students having to drop out of school, some young girls having to be forced into early marriages because their parents expect a bride price from the men that they're marrying them to. And you find that climate change is a disaster. It is a disaster. And when you go to the western part of the country, they have experienced floods as well. Because when the river banks burst, that means a lot of water pours in people's homes, in people's farms, and they lose everything. And we've seen that not just recently in the COVID-19 pandemic. This is something that has been happening for a long time. And I personally believe that this is an urgent issue. This is a crisis that we need to put an end to right now, because people's livelihoods are being destroyed.
Devastating, definitely. And that's why your work is so important. I have to say, we haven't talked to very many people from Africa or South America, the global South, leaders who are tackling climate change. And so that's why I think it's so important to amplify your voice. And I'm glad it is being amplified, because we need more people in the global South doing climate change work and advocating for those voiceless voices. So thank you for that. Jean?
Vanessa, it's a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for making the time for us today. Um, as Ming was just alluding to, we've had a few guests on the show previously, but they've been more from Europe and North America. So it's great to have you all on board to explain, what the challenges are in another part of the world. I'm calling from Australia, and as we've said before as well, we have our own challenges. Probably the highest profile one is our Great Barrier Reef. That affects our tourism and the economy in that way. There's a few other challenges that we have over here, but they don't sound as extreme as what you've just mentioned. So it's very important that you really tell the story and get the news out about how it affects your part of the world. So with that in mind, I just wanted to ask, how has your experience been as an activist? It seems like you've reached not just locally, but also internationally. And how can you relate your experience as opposed to someone who may be from North America or Europe?
Becoming an activist, of course, these were very, very humble beginnings for me, because I was doing it in my community during the climate strikes in my country. And honestly, I never thought that it would go international at any point in life. I was literally doing it directly for the leaders in my country to take action and see the investments that they accept into the country, mainly because I was posting my work on social media, that is Twitter, and I guess many people are seeing it. And of course, it hasn't been an easy journey. There are always ups and downs, and the ups always they outweigh the downs. But well, the challenges that I've really faced in this journey as an activist are my family. In the beginning, of course, they didn't understand what I was doing, and also my friends, they weren't really supportive, because they found what I was doing very weird, and they would never imagine that I would go to the street and demand for climate action. They thought it was out of this world. It was something new to them. So it was really hard, because I had to do the first strikes by myself. And these went on for quite a long time, for some months, while doing the strikes by myself and sharing my work on social media, that is Twitter. But then later on, of course, people started getting involved, because probably they were seeing the impact that was starting to be caused, and my voice was starting to be heard, and my story was starting to be listened to by international media. And when many of them started to see that, they realized that actually what I was fighting for was something very, very important, because it isn't common to see a young person, especially someone from an African country, be recognized internationally because of the work that they are doing. So most of my friends, when they saw something like that, they were pushed to believe that this was something actually important, because by the time she's recognized or she's invited for climate conferences to speak, that means the work that she's doing is important, and it involves protection of the people and the planet, and she's actually serious about her climate activism. So there have been ups and downs, but the most important thing has always been focusing on the message, focusing on the activism, because at the end of it all, we need a better and a healthier future for everyone.
Oh, I was just thinking, maybe there's an undercurrent of displeasure with the way things are panning out, like you said before, and maybe you have to be the first one to speak up, because otherwise you know, you'll just be waiting for someone else. But it seems like you must have a lot of people who agree with you, and that must really it's kind of bittersweet. You don't want to have to do this, but if you need to, then you are getting the support that you need to propel that message forward.
Speaking of, feeling alone and not having a team on this journey. So I wanted to get your take on why it's important to include diverse voices. I know you had that whole disastrous experience with the Associated Press of them, cropping the photo with all those youth activists, and then they see someone of color and they just crop it off. And so why is it important to include diverse voices, such as African people or people with disabilities?
Diversity is important in this movement simply because every activist has a story to tell, and every story has solutions to give, and every solution has a life to change. So there are quite a number of activists from different parts of the world, especially those in the marginalized communities. It's funny how they are affected the most by the climate crisis, and yet they are the least contributors to the emissions in the atmosphere. So it is fair enough to have them on the table, to listen to their stories and to amplify their stories, because if these stories are not amplified, that means we won't be able to get climate justice. Climate justice isn't justice if it doesn't involve everyone. You know, you find that the international community will make decisions in regards to climate action that work for them, but they won't think about the solutions that are needed in these communities that are being affected right now. When you talk about starting climate action, maybe renewable energy by 2050, that doesn't work for me. That doesn't work for someone from an African country. That doesn't work for someone from the global south. They need resilience now to help them as we move towards the Green New Deal, as we move towards a better future, as we move towards actual climate action, to that point where we see that, okay, we have done something in regards to the climate crisis. They need to understand that there are people who are suffering now, and we can stop their suffering not just by taking climate action and placing years on when we'll stop using coal or stop investments in the fossil fuel industry. As you look towards those years, focus on the resilience in these communities so that even when they face water scarcity, they have a backup of maybe water storage mechanisms. These are things that we don't see in these communities. That is why I think it is important for every activist to be listened to. Diversity is really important, because if we do not embrace diversity, that means erasure of very many people's voices. And if very many people's voices are continuously erased, that means we won't get solutions for these communities that are affected the most. I am from Uganda, but I may have the statistics of what is happening in Nigeria, but I don't know what is happening on ground. An activist in Nigeria can do a better explaining in regards to what is happening there. I am not in India, but I may have some of the statistics. But an activist from India tells their story better than I would tell their story. That's why I think it's important to include every voice, because we all have different stories. We all have different challenges, different problems that we are seeing in our communities in regards to the climate crisis. And when we present these problems, that is when we will be able to see solutions that ensure that everyone's life is protected. Because if there is no diversity in the climate movement, that means we will never have climate justice at all.
Yeah, very passionately said. And as you were saying in your Twitter post, that they're not, in that particular instance at Davos, they weren't just erasing you, this one girl in Uganda. It's a whole continent being represented, right? Especially
Exactly.
in a place like Davos, where you don't see probably that many people of color. It's mostly white, wealthy men who go to those kind of things, as you saw,
Yeah.
I'm sure. So the next couple questions are on people with disabilities specifically. It's intersectional, so on climate change and disability, but I want you to, when you answer, focus on people with disabilities in your country or around the world. So you said, I'm quoting you again, many people, farms, many people's farms, homes have been destroyed and washed away by the floods. In cases, people are dying and losing their property as well because of the bursting of riverbanks. So my question is, how and why do you think these conditions are particularly hard for people with disabilities in your country, especially, you know, physical disabilities?
Well, when it comes to disabilities, for example, if a climate disaster like a flood finds someone who is using a wheelchair, they have a very low chance of survival. How will they be able to try and save their lives with just a wheelchair? Because many people at that point are trying to save their own lives. No one may remember to help them push that wheelchair to safety. So many of them stand a high chance of being killed by these floods. Some people are blind, but how can they see disaster coming to them? If they wake up with a flood, or when their families are filled up with when their houses are filled up with water. For example, there is a time when Lake Victoria's water levels rose, and people's homes were filled with water because the water encroached their houses. Now imagine that water finding someone who is blind. How will they try to save themselves from that disaster? Yes, they may try to walk out of the house before maybe the water drowns them. That is if they're an adult, because the water may find a baby or a younger child whose height doesn't go above the water. So this puts them at risk of drowning because of the water levels. But if it's also an adult who is tall enough, yes, they may be able to walk out of the house. But then where are they walking into? They are walking into more water on the outside. So I think that the people with disabilities, not just in my country, but in the different parts of the world, they stand a very high chance. It's not even a chance, it's disaster. I mean, they're at a risk of losing their lives in the case of occurrence of disasters such as the floods, the hurricanes, the landslides. Because in case of a crisis, everyone is trying to save themselves, and no one may ever remember to hold that hand, to push that wheelchair. No one may ever remember that because they're trying to save their own skin. That is why it is important for us to see that action is taken. We cannot continue seeing people being affected. Yes, all of us are vulnerable to the climate crisis. We can all be victims. But there are people who face a higher risk of being affected, of being killed by these climate disasters. And some of those people are those with disabilities. And that is why it is important to ensure that climate action is taken.
So I don't think I could have said it better myself. And to be honest with you, of all of the guests that we've had, I think you worded the clearest and the most vivid, in the most vivid way of how these disasters are going to affect people who are poor, people who have disabilities, people of color. As you were saying in one of your Twitter posts, Africa is the continent that at least emits the least amount of carbon emissions, aside from Antarctica, I'm assuming. So anyways, thank you for that. I know you're not a disability advocate, but the way you communicate is so clear. It really paints a vivid image and help people relate on an emotional level as well, which I think is a lot of times what compels people to act. So how do you think people with disabilities in Uganda can be effective in the climate change activism work? What resources can be provided to people with disabilities to become more proactive, productive citizens in the climate change movement? I know you're one of the leaders now, so you're able to advocate for those kind of resources and to have more voices be heard and be involved.
Well, I think that the best way is, first of all, educating them, because you may find that not all of them are aware of the risk that they face in regards to climate change. Most of them may not understand how much their lives are at stake when it comes to the climate crisis. So I think the first step is educating them, and of course, the resources that are needed for educating, basically going into those communities or the organizations or places where we can find these people and educate them about the climate crisis and how can they be part, how can they be part of the climate movement, of the climate strikes. Yes, we have digital strikes. If they are not able to go to the streets, they can do digital strikes, but then not all of them have access to the internet. Not all of them have access to computers or to phones, because many of them are, because of their disabilities, some of them, the result is a discrimination at workplaces, and many of them, they just live lives of survival. They don't have enough money that they can use to buy a gadget or to subscribe for internet. So internet and a phone or a computer would be a very good resource in helping them connect to the different people in different parts of the world and tell their story. I'm really glad that you brought up that question, because it is very, very emotional to realize that there are people who face a much deeper risk than all of us. And I think we need to tell their stories. And I think when we are not hearing more of their stories in the different parts of the world, and I think that helping them have access to the internet or basically to social media to tell their stories, that would help through providing them with phones or with computers where they can easily talk about their experiences, talk about the challenges that they face, and demand for action. And then those who are able to go to the streets, the best thing that we can provide for them is protection, because we understand sometimes the strikes in the streets can get so violent sometimes. So we need to ensure their protection as much as possible. But the most important thing is assuring that the world hears their voices. And the world cannot hear their voices if they don't have a gadget, if they don't have access to internet. I cannot tell the story of someone with a disability more than they can say it. Yes, I may advocate and say that the people with disabilities are being affected the most by the climate crisis. But it is better to hear these words from them themselves, because it causes much more impact.
Exactly. And that's so true. I think just like hearing from you, who uh, you're from the global south, Uganda, a country that is very much affected by climate change at a very basic level. There's food insecurity, meaning there's actual hunger going on. There are families that are hungry and starving because of climate change. And so I think your perspective is so valuable, because even though we've talked to a lot of, high level people on our show, nobody has described it like as urgently, I would say, as you have, because you've personally seen the effects of it on people on a more daily basis than somebody who is, the CEO or a politician or whatnot. So thank you so much for your important work. And I hope that now that you are a leader in this area, and when you do have the resources to provide those gadgets, to provide those information, the whether that be attitudinal or physical infrastructure to make it happen for people with disabilities to make their voices be heard.
But like I just feel so emotional right now, because it's just hitting my heart, like to think about how much. Yes, I have thought about it, but then this podcast has really made me think much more about it, and I can actually see how much danger that these people face and how much we need to help them as much as possible and as soon as possible.
Yeah, it's a very urgent issue for sure.
I guess we'd just probably continue with that same topic about information. particularly how it seems like you have had good access to information and you've been able to repeat that on Twitter um, to people who follow you. So, like you said before, the effects of climate change are more felt by the people of Africa, and yet Africa may emit the least amount of carbon. So that's a very general statement, and I could believe that in just GDP terms and things like that. But I guess while those emotions are still raw, would you mind maybe describing some other experiences which you've come across or seen with your own eyes or heard from your friends and family, so that you can share those with us and the people watching this show?
Well, yes, what I've really seen and heard, I remember before starting activism, I talked to an uncle of mine who has, of course, lived longer than I have. And he told me that 20 years back in his village, the farmers used to specifically love the month of January. That is the first month of the year because of how much their crops thrived during that period. And then he said that 20 years later, January is known as the hottest month of the year in literally the entire country, and farmers dread it because of how much they lose their crops because of drying up. And that is one of the things that actually pushed me into reading more about climate change and understanding what this crisis really means, you know. So that was the first hand information I really got when it comes to the impacts, and it made me realize at that point that the food sector in my country is greatly affected by the climate crisis. I have personally seen uh, heavy rainfall in my country, unexpected, and I have seen flooding in the city, and I've watched the news, and you find that each time it rains, most times it rains, some people or some children are swept away by the flood, even in the city itself, because cities in the city there are always like trenches, you know trenches, right? So in the city there are always like trenches, uh like drainage systems, I think, that where water passes. So you find that someone may be driving, or someone may be on a bicycle after maybe it has just rained, or someone may be on a motorcycle. We have so many of them this side, and they may not be able to realize that there is actually a trench here, and many of them are swept away because when they drive, they just find themselves falling into the trench. And it is very disturbing. I've had many of those stories before. I remember sometime my father telling me about how one of his customers was buying something from the shop, and then he received a call, and the call was telling him, "Sir, your son has just been swept away by the flood of the rain." In my country, I think it's just a general thing. Children love to play so much in the rain, and many of them run away from home to play in the rain, even when parents do not accept it. So you find that in that scenario of too much rainfall and the trenches drying up, some of the children are swept away by those rains, by those floods, because they never expect that this place actually has a hole, it has a trench, it has a ditch, because everywhere is filled with water. That is why it is even advisable, do not walk around in town if it has just rained, because you may fall a victim unless you're really sure of where you are walking, where you're walking from. It's better to wait for like 1 hour until the water completely calms down and you can see the trenches, you can see the ditches, so that you can survive being swept away by those waters. Those are some of the other effects that I've seen. And of course, the climate crisis is also increasing the issue of inequalities, gender inequalities, because I come from a country whereby in the rural communities, it is the women who put food on the table, it is the women who provide water for domestic use for their families. So in the case of these disasters, many of them lose so much of their hard work to climate disasters, and many of them have to walk very long distances to fetch water for their families. So the climate crisis is continuously pushing these communities into more gender inequalities, pushing these communities into more extreme poverty, making it making it actually making us realize that if we do not take climate action, that means we won't be able to eradicate poverty, we won't be able to achieve zero hunger. Yeah.
And just to think that, you know, it's the other countries, states, and continents who will put more of the carbon in the atmosphere, which are causing devastating effects for people just who want to walk down the street after it rains. It just seems so unfair. So I can understand where the passion comes from. If number one, you can't get food because your crops are being affected, but then you can't simply just walk down the street after it's rained. That's it's not fair.
It is amazing how passionately and vividly you describe these things, Vanessa. And I think it's because you see it every day. Unlike people in the global north, I live in Washington, D.C. Yeah, I see the temperatures are some days are hotter than next, but I can come into a room with AC and ignore it for a day, a week, even a month. But for people who are in, areas that are more rural, as in, rural parts of Uganda or even urban parts of Uganda, you can't just hide in a room with AC and just ignore the signs of climate change, and the floods. Yeah, and I think you understand the urgency better than probably anybody we've had on the show so far. So, as you expressed earlier, the Congo Basin is the second largest rainforest in the world. Earlier, I meant like not in this interview. The Congo Basin is the second largest rainforest in the world with incredible biodiversity that includes over 10,000 species of plants and 1,000 species of birds. So, can you tell us what is currently happening to this rich biodiversity over there, and why are the international media outlets not reporting as much about it as you would like them to?
The world only cares about other forests, and we never see African forests being talked about. That is the time I decided to read more about the Congo rainforest. I've never really seen it in person, but what I read about it was pretty interesting to realize how many species of animals, species of plants, species of trees, birds reside in that forest, and realizing that over 70 million people, indigenous people, heavily depend on the existence of that forest, and also realizing that this forest has some of the most sought after minerals like petroleum. And when I got all this information, um, I know the fossil fuel industry. I know that it is after any deposits of oil or petroleum anywhere. So I didn't have to visit the Congo rainforest. It was what I read that made me question what was happening there. Because if the world was focusing on other forests, what if this forest was being secretly destroyed? So I started looking out for articles that were talking about destruction of the Congo rainforest or the dangers that the Congo rainforest faces. And one of the articles that I found out was saying if nothing is done about the deforestation in Congo rainforest, we may lose it by 2100. And then I'm like, but no one is talking about this if it is in the articles. That is when I decided to start striking for this forest. Even though I hadn't seen it in person, I just knew that there was something happening. It can't have petroleum, and then nothing is happening there. And when I started striking for it, a friend of mine from Russia sent me a map that was showing Russia's plans for Africa. And one of those plans was construction of a gas pipeline in Congo rainforest. And that is the point that I was like, I knew this was going to happen, or I knew this was already happening. So not having seen the forest in person wasn't something that could stop me from advocating for it, because what I had read was enough. And realizing that there were so many indigenous people depending on this forest, I knew that it deserved to be fought for and it deserved to be protected. Because if we fight for the protection of this forest, that means we are fighting for the people whose lives depend on it. For some species that face extinction, there is a specific species, it's called the forest giraffe, also known as okapi, and it is only found in the Congo rainforest, meaning that if we lose the forest, we won't ever see or hear about this species again. The coming generation will only study about it in history, you know? So I realized that we have to protect the forest for the people who are living right now, especially for the indigenous people who directly benefit from this forest. For Africa as a continent, because to Africa, it is a lung. And then for the world, because it doesn't just benefit the African people, it benefits the entire world. That is why I decided to start striking for it and stop any kind of deforestation that is going on right now.
Yeah, I find your story so incredible, Vanessa, because you're functioning on very limited resources in one of the most um, low resource countries in the world, in Africa, Uganda, and and but despite that, you went out and started protesting. It wasn't anything fancy. You just went out to the streets. You had a sign, you had a mission, and then it started growing. But it started with one person. You had you cared about something, and then you went out and did something about it, and then it grew. And so I think that's just incredible. If more people were more empowered like you to just take action on the different issues they care about and just not be afraid to just go out there and stand alone by yourself um, for a cause that you believed in, even though, like you just said, you've never seen the rainforest before. So is that right? Have you seen the rainforest now?
No,
Not yet. And yet you've
no,
been,
not yet.
advocating for its survival. So I just find that so incredible, and I'm glad your voice is being amplified. So you say you didn't realize climate change was a huge problem until you started doing your own research. Why do you think it is not being taught in schools if it's such a huge issue that affects people's livelihoods in Uganda?
It is the school system that we have, and in the school system, almost everything is feels like history, not something that is happening, and everything feels like theory, especially when you come to the art students, those ones who do history, those ones who do geography. I didn't do sciences, so I don't know if they really talk about the environment or climate stuff. But I think if you specifically major into environmental studies, then that is when you can get a glimpse of climate action, of climate change, and everything about global warming. But then I personally did business administration, and there was never any topic about climate change. And also, even in high school, I don't remember studying about the reality of climate change. Of course, there is a topic. I think it's more like the protocol of studying. There is a topic, they give you a definition, what is climate change, and then they tell you the causes, they tell you the impacts, and it just ends there. So it's more like the theory part of it. They teach you, you do exams, you pass, and then you're promoted to the next class. So it was never about the practical bit of it. It was never about the reality of what is happening. And I think that is something that is really lacking in our schools. I don't know about the other schools in different parts of the world, if they are also having this climate education, but I think that many schools or many governments, they have never held it as an important subject, or you may find that they don't want to teach the students because they expect the students to protest if they realize that this is actually a serious issue, and then we don't see the action that is, that is needed. So it's more of the theory that they give you than the practical. So I think it's an entire school system that needs to change, that will ensure that the students get more of what is happening on ground than what is happening in the textbooks they give us.
And hopefully, with your advocacy, things will change. You're going to change the world, Vanessa, or at least Africa, and then have its ripple effects of its own. So you conveyed that it's disturbing that there are people who believe that climate activism is a waste of time, but we need to educate our people about the climate crisis and tell them the truth they don't want to hear. We need to tell them that climate change is real and dangerous for us all, unquote. So how have you been able to mobilize Ugandans to care about climate change? How are you measuring progress in your activism work? Because I know you started out as one person, and then gradually a group of people started becoming aware and has joined the activism work. But as we just said, the education system don't even teach it, and the government isn't exactly all that proactive about it. So
First thing that I really did to, get more young people to join the climate activism was by continuing. Because if I had put an end to climate activism, that means that many wouldn't have been inspired to actually join the activism. And then the other thing, in my activism, I've done climate education in schools. I have gone to schools and educated students. I go and talk to the principals and the directors and request them for some time to talk to the students and also strike with them, because it is very hard. It is very hard to see students walk out of school in my country, because many of them would be subjected to either suspension or expulsion. It's kind of different uh, from what we see in the global north. So most of the education has been by me going to these schools and talking to the students and telling them about the climate crisis, about the environment, and what they can do about it. And then the other thing has been organizing community cleanups, whereby I go with other activists and we do cleanups like sweeping, like people's communities, because this gives us an opportunity to interact with them in the language that they understand. The other way that I've brought climate education, I started a project that involves installation of solar panels and eco-friendly stoves in schools. And I chose this project because I wanted to bring climate solutions in my community and in my country. And I know that we need a transition to renewable energy, but not everyone is able to access it. Not everyone is able to afford it. But through this project, these schools are able to get everything, or the installation of the solar and the eco-friendly stoves at no cost, because there is really no reason that a school in Uganda shouldn't have a stove or electricity for their students. And also it's a learning experience, as I said, because the students are always curious. They want to know why you brought the solar. They want to know why you didn't bring the other electricity that they're probably used to at their homes. And this provides an opportunity to teach them about the environment, about the importance of renewable energy, about the eco-friendly stoves. And yeah, I think this is like a wrap up of some of the things that I've been doing with also other activists to try and bring this education to the different people. Of course, we may not be able to reach everyone, but we try as much as possible to reach those that we are able to. And also using social media, it has been a a great way of, passing on the message, because many people send messages on social media saying that they're inspired, asking how they can join the movement, asking how they can start striking. So social media has also played a very, very big role in helping us tell the stories and also inspire other people to join the climate movement.
Yeah, I saw that you said your social media has grown. So in a way, that Associated Press fiasco was a blessing in disguise, right? Because you kind of grew your social media um, platforms, and so yeah, so that's incredible, and that's really great work that you're doing as well.
So I want to talk about the Rise Up movement that you started, and but before that, I just want to clarify. You've mentioned so many things that you've been involved in, started, and helped along in terms of education and just basically you're doing a lot as an activist. But I just realized that you're only 23 years old. Is that right?
Yes.
You have probably inspired more people and done more work than anyone who we've spoken to in a practical sense by the age of even 30. So I just want to say that that's an incredible and inspiring story, and to see that you have so much passion and are so eloquent at describing the problems and the potential solutions when you're just at 23. And I'm just quite, I'm really touched by how much you carry forward and how confidently you put, your arguments forward. So with that, onto what you started, the Rise Up movement. If you could just quickly tell us how you got that started and what work you're currently doing and what impacts you've made so far.
I started the Rise Up movement basically to help amplify the voices of different climate activists from the African continent. And as Rise Up movement, of course, we have quite a number of activists that we are working with, and we've done some projects to help amplify these activists' stories, and some of them have been doing videos on social media, especially in this period of lockdown. We've done so many videos and taken so many photos, passing on a message. I'm sure you've seen some messages like small acts when multiplied by millions of people can transform the world. In the beginning, I thought I was fighting to save a forest. So we all carry the same message, and then just literally post it on social media, especially Twitter, so that everyone can get to know that the climate crisis is still on. The climate crisis isn't in lockdown. It is in quarantine. It is here, and it is still destroying people's lives. And we've also had a podcast where we've interviewed people. Of course, it has been more like a learning process for us as a way of telling people's stories. And we've shared some of these stories on this podcast, shared some stories on YouTube. And recently we started a specific project. It is called 1 Million Activist Stories. And we opened up a website, and that is like one of our biggest achievements yet. And we are sharing different stories of different activists on this podcast, and basically telling their stories. And when it comes to this podcast, it isn't, sorry, when it comes to the website, it isn't specific that it's only for the African activists. We are sharing every story of every activist, regardless of where they come from. As I said in the beginning, I personally believe that every activist has a story to tell. And if we have the platform, then we need to use these platforms to tell these stories. And also as Rise Up, we've been able to get more opportunities for some of the activists to tell their stories, because it is very hard to, have media report your work, especially when you're an individual activist. But through Rise Up, I'm able to make some connections and reach out to different media outlets. and to ask them to interview other activists in Africa and share their stories. And yeah, that's basically what we've been doing in regards to Rise Up. But its main goal is to amplify the African stories because they are important and they need to be listened to.
That's fantastic. And it makes sense because I hear that the average age in Uganda may be much lower than, say, in North America. And to have someone who is around about the same age as the population who can really latch on to the stories and relate to you, you would probably be um, quite the person to relay that message um, to your leaders and also around the world in terms of getting media attention. So it makes a lot of sense, and I'm sure they're very glad to have you there.
Thank you.
Yeah, so moving on to the leaders. So who are the leaders you're demanding climate change actions from? Just to get a clarification of that, and what roles do they play, if relevant? And what specific actions can they take to mitigate climate change, do you think?
Well, when it comes to the leaders in my country, my demands are for them to save the investments that come into our country, especially the fossil fuel investments, because I know that we have some petroleum in some parts of the country, and my demands are for my country leaders to not accept these investments because that would just make the climate crisis even worse. But then the biggest demand goes to the international community because we are in the climate crisis because of the emissions that come from the fossil fuel industry that is heavily dominated by the international community. I want the leaders in the international community to lead by example, because many times they talk about leading the Green New Deal, leading the climate action, especially Europe. But then many times their actions are very disappointing because they continuously invest in the fossil fuel industry. I remember reading an article during this lockdown that was talking about investment of over $7 billion in the fossil fuel industry in this lockdown period. And I think it is really crazy. And then I remember reading an article that a minister in a certain country, I don't seem to remember the country, that suggested that they go ahead with their plans of the fossil fuel industry because the activists cannot protest. And I was like, seriously, what is happening? I think that the leaders in the international community need to lead by example. That is the only way that we'll get the climate crisis. German extended coal to 2038, but that doesn't help us. Yes, it may help Germany, but it doesn't help the communities that are already suffering right now. They don't have to wait for more 18 years to actually see visible action. Because if they are to push coal to 2038, that only means that we will not get rid of it in 2038. Because yes, they'll put a close to it in 2038, and then in 2038, that is when they'll start bringing in our different investments that ensure protection of the planet. And I think that we don't have to wait for the planet's and the people's protection. We don't have to wait for 2038. We need to start now. As I already said, that some people in the international community, they want climate action so that they can survive the increasing temperatures, or it's really funny. And yet there are communities that want climate action in order to survive, in order to be able to see the future, in order to be able to see their children go to school, their families have something to eat, their families have access to water. That is the difference here, you know the climate crisis is affecting us differently. That is why we are seeing less commitments from the international community. So, my demand to the international community is to lead by example. If they are saying that they are going to lead the Green New Deal, it has to start now. It doesn't have to start after 20 years because we don't have time left. I mean, we already lost time. The moment people started dying as a result of the climate crisis, the moment people started suffering as a result of climate change, that is when we lost all our time. And this is something that they need to accept right now. We, the young people, we, the youth, and the different teenagers, we are showing them the direction. We are showing them what they need to do and the decisions that they need to make. But we don't know if they'll be able to take those actions that will ensure the protection of the people and the planet. We need more investments in renewable energy. We need more resilience in the most affected communities. We need to protect our ecosystems as much as possible. And we can only do this if there is political will.
And I hope that you will think to not only do this activism work and continue to make it as big as you possibly can, because I think it's such valuable, important, life-saving work, but also think to become one of those uh, leaders who not only show the path but guide the path and lead the path. I think you'll have that kind of influence, especially if you maintain the kind of pure hearts and amazing mission that you have now. I think a lot of times, we get, it's not that people don't know that climate change isn't a problem. It's that once they are in a position where they have the power to make those changes, they're comfortable and they have, the wealth and the resources, the power, the prestige, whatnot. They have all the things for an individualistic life to thrive, but not for the collective. As you said, in the global north, such as countries such as like where I live in the United States, per capita carbon emission is so high. And in Africa, people are functioning on so little. And I don't want to say Africa is one conglomerate. I was in Malawi actually a few months ago. It's 54 countries and very diverse and very rich in culture. And the per capita resources there is much lower. How much resources you guys use per capita versus someone in the US or in Europe or in Australia, and yet you're suffering the consequences of climate change more acutely than anybody over here, than most people over here. And so I think it's important for you to be an advocate, but also strive to be a leader. So thank you so much for your incredible work, and thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much for inviting me on the podcast because I really appreciate any opportunity of my story being told. So thank you very much.
Did you like this video? If so, share with your friends and be sure to follow us on social media. And if you want even more resources, be sure to sign up for our email updates on our website, traipsingglobal.com. Keep learning new perspectives, keep being inclusive, because it will make the world a better place for you and for everyone else. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you on another episode of the Traipsing Global on Wheels podcast hour.